Today, it sometimes feels like we're living under a hippie dictatorship. One of the most striking things about the culture wars has been the rise of the countercultural outlook, which is now thoroughly mainstream. And one of the most peculiar things about the culture wars is how authoritarian that countercultural outlook turned out to be. How hostile to free thought and individual autonomy the countercultural sentiment really is. All the once countercultural trends that are now deeply embedded in everyday society, from the environmentalist ethos to feminist thinking to the therapeutic self-exploring urge, have proven to be quite censorious and suffocating of autonomy rather than liberating. The beatniks and hippies and bra burners of the 1960s and 70s were outwardly anti-authoritarian, outwardly free-spirited, yet their political legacy is one of stricture, new orthodoxies, a climate of control and even of individual submission to new social mores. How did this happen? How did the apparently freewheeling, spliff-smoking counterculture of the 1960s give rise to the soul-destroying environmentalism and speech-policing feminism of today? How did the outlook of those tradition-trampling outsiders become so insider and also so fundamentally killjoy? Grizzled old hippies love to say that if you can remember the 1960s, then you weren't really there. But sadly, even those of us who can't remember them, on account of the fact that we weren't born, are living with the consequences of the 1960s, or rather with the consequences of the countercultural politics that emerged in that decade, and which, largely by default, have become the dominant politics of the modern era. The success of the countercultural outlook has been extraordinary. Ideas which just a couple of generations ago were considered edgy and weird, held only by middle-class enlightened youth and rejected by the man, are now the organising principles of modern society. Most strikingly, environmentalism, the concern with man's polluting hubris and his rampaging desire for stuff, has gone from being a fringe whinge of long-haired nature lovers to being the most valuable political currency of the age. Every government on Earth now pays at least lip service to the need to protect nature from mankind's more brutal instincts for exploration and exploitation. International bodies have been set up to harangue nation-states about how much they pollute. Virtually every schoolchild in the Western world is educated to live, think and act greenly, which is to say meekly. Feminism too has moved from the streets and the occupied lecture halls of radicalised universities into the heart of social policy making. And not only in a good way, in the sense of having equal pay policies or childcare provision, but in a bad way too. The feminist ethos is now often used by figures of authority to denounce allegedly masculine values, such as self-reliance, individualism, a preference for victory over consensus. Indeed, feminism has been turned into something of a battering ram against the testy clash of ideas that was once the lifeblood of politics, by campaigners who say we need a more feminised style of political life. As one expert says of Britain's House of Commons, its Yahoo culture is finally being undercut by the arrival of more women MPs who, quote, introduce a kinder, gentler politics characterised by cooperation rather than conflict, because women are less adversarial and better team players, end quote. This strikes me as not only threatening to the practice of politics, which ought to be all about fiery conflict and crashing visions, but also extremely patronising to women. The depiction of women as kind, gentle souls takes us back, ironically, to a pre-60s outlook, and yet it's a depiction frequently promoted by modern feminists themselves, against the caricature of the bad, swaggering man with his apparently problematic principles and convictions. Likewise, feminist campaigners are often at the forefront of demanding new forms of censorship. Whether their target is porn, the Sun's page 3, or the use of sexist language by internet trolls, feminists seem keen to keep a watchful eye on what the rest of us look at, say, and ultimately think. And again, a paradoxically patronising attitude motors these feminist campaigns against offensive images and words. The anti-Page 3 campaign group complains that Page 3 has a negative impact on the self-esteem of women and girls. How odd that a countercultural outlook that started out promoting a vision of women as capable should end up depicting women as easily reduced to pathetic puddles of self-loathing upon seeing a photo of a half-naked lady or hearing an offensive word. The therapeutic trend of the 1960s counterculture, the tendency to spend more time staring at one's own navel than observing the wider world, is also now everywhere. From Oprah's couch to the covers of myriad celeb magazines, people are letting it all hang out in a way that once only hippies did, while the rest of society winced with embarrassment. It's now normal to talk openly about our foibles, failures and sicknesses. Indeed, it's the people who don't do this who are considered weird. They're said to be in denial. As one British writer said recently, Stoicism is increasingly seen as pathological. It's apparently healthy to advertise your inner universe and unhealthy to keep it private. The counterculturalists' intense preoccupation with the self, as the brilliant social critic Christopher Lasch called it, is now commonplace. And as with environmentalism's intolerant insistence that we all buy into the Green Bible, and feminism's policing of problematic attitudes and speech, there's an authoritarian impulse to the therapeutic ethos. It has nurtured more and more official intervention into private life and even emotional life, as everyone from the nudge industry to the anger management movement seeks to make us all into transparent and correctly ordered individuals. So how did the counterculture turn out to be not the liberator of individuals, but rather the midwife of a new authoritarianism? It's quite logical, actually. It's because the counterculture nurtured a view of individuals as fundamentally weak, lost, battered by forces beyond their control, whether corporations or the man, and thus in need of the assistance and guidance of others. Critics of the counterculture often lambast the hippie generation for promoting individualism. But the problem with the 60s rebels wasn't that they promoted the individual, but that they promoted the self, which is a very different thing. They didn't sing the praises of the morally autonomous individual, the potential master of his fate and contributor to social virtue, as the 19th century liberals did. Instead, they elevated the self, the cut-off, confused self who could master nothing more than his own style and attitude, his coolness and demeanour. This was recognised by the American sociologist David Riesman as early as 1960. Observing beatnik attitudes, Riesman pointed out that these youngsters made claims to individuality, but actually didn't seem to have much presence, as he described it. Unlike earlier liberal individualists, these modern youths do not have a polished personality, but rather an affable, casual, adaptable one, said Riesman. This was taken further by Christopher Lasch in his 1979 book, The Culture of Narcissism. Lasch said the countercultural generation and the modern pieties they spawned actually rejected the liberal conception of man. He said that where 19th century liberals assumed the primacy of rational self-interest when thinking about the individual man, modern progressives have introduced a therapeutic conception of man, which acknowledges irrational drives. In short, the counterculture shifted liberalism from thinking of man as rational and capable to thinking of him as weak and alone. The counterculture ultimately represented an unravelling of the idea of human subjectivity, of the idea of the history-making man. With its attacks on industry, economic growth, progress, and any other arrogant attempt by mankind to consciously organise society, and its elevation instead of therapeutic self-exploration and environmentalist stewardship, the counterculture gave rise to a view of man as small, insignificant, possibly best restrained. In the words of Lasch, in the moment of that countercultural turn, the conquest for nature and new frontiers gave way to the search for self-fulfillment. That is, people were encouraged to turn their gaze away from massive matters like nature, economy and exploration, in favour of tweaking their inner self, exploring their minds and bodies rather than their surroundings. And it follows that if man really is not rational, but rather is propelled by irrational drives, then there will have to be structures to govern his behaviour and control his urges. To cite Lasch once more, modern progressives' promotion of the idea that we're all just a bunch of selves who are quite irrational leads to a situation where the whole man is brought under social control. Thanks to the counterculture's replacement of politics with therapy and external exploration with self-exploration, modern liberal society now regulates private life as well as work, said Lasch, and exposes the innermost secrets of the psyche to medical scrutiny. The true individualists of the older liberal era believed in people's ability to govern their own lives and to engage with society as rational, potentially virtuous beings. The self-obsessives of the countercultural era and its aftermath have no such faith in the capacities of man, and so they have implicitly helped to build a kind of bureaucratic scaffolding around us, allowing experts to peer into our minds and PC censors to cover our eyes and ears lest our irrational drives are unleashed. We need a new culture to counter this counterculture, one which trusts individuals to determine their destinies without needing hippies turned authoritarians to hold their hands or massage their minds.